Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the WellMed Charitable Foundation Caregiver Teleconnection. Our presentation today is by Jim Taylor, and it's about his organization, Voices of Alzheimer's. It's also about his journey. So let me tell you a little bit about Jim. Jim received an MBA from the University of Chicago and had a successful career in IBM and finance. His wife, Geri, was diagnosed in 2012 with mild cognitive impairment, later clarified as Alzheimer's disease. Geri and Jim have spoken to over 15,000 people across the US and in Europe, addressing stigma, how to live well with dementia, and promoting clinical trial participation. In September 2020, the couple was awarded the Perennial Hero Award by the Alliance for Aging Research. It's in Washington, D.C., Jim?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, wow. For their Alzheimer's advocacy. Jim is an FDA-appointed Alzheimer's patient advocate. Didn't even know they had those. It's wonderful. In June 2021, he was appointed by Governor Cuomo as a patient advocate on the New York State Alzheimer's Council. Jim serves as president and CEO of Voices of Alzheimer's, a prominent advocacy organization founded in September 2022. Voices of Alzheimer's mission is to promote speedy and equitable access to FDA-approved diagnostics and therapeutics for Alzheimer's disease. In January, Jim spoke in Davos, Switzerland, at the Alzheimer's Roundtable during the World Economic Forum. Boy, there's something that got you. So, Jim, please, I know you wanted to share something from your wife. Please take your time and do that for us.
Thank you, Evelyn. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be with you today, and I very much appreciate the opportunity. I want to clarify that I am in Connecticut, so all of you in sunshiny states, I'm very envious. I'm 78 years old. My wife, Geri, is 80, and she was diagnosed 12 years ago with Alzheimer's, first MCI and then clarified as Alzheimer's. She entered a memory care facility about 4 months ago. So always before when we've spoken, it's been very much a partnership. So now she and I are both adjusting to our new lives, continuing our joint advocacy, but in a much changed environment. I am not a clinician. I have no training in healthcare. My wife was an outstanding nurse. So anything I tell you is suspect and should be validated. But I've learned a lot in the last 12 years about this journey. I'd like to start it with a recording that we did a year or two ago that kind of sets a tone. And I'd like to share it for you now.
Living with Alzheimer's means to me that you have to understand that things can change in the course of a day, and you have to live with those changes to be comfortable and happy. You have to take what you have, and I'm doing well with it.
Tell us about the day you learned of your diagnosis.
We went to the doctor,
Neurologist.
the neurologist, because I was pretty sure that that was the path that I was on. So I was feeling a release that that was the case. But I must say, when we left the office, it just kind of got me right in my insides that this was a big turn in my personhood.
Have you ever felt that people treat you differently because of the diagnosis?
Yes, people who aren't around me so much, they want to hold my elbow. They want to point out things as if I can't see well or I might topple over. And it's difficult because their intention is good, but when they always ask me to sit down, well, why? I think people expect that we're gonna go off the rails, that we're gonna do silly or stupid things. But, you know, we're just regular people with Alzheimer's.
I remember you explained it. You're not thinking about what you're going to say next, as so often we do, because you don't have that capacity. And you don't have overhanging thoughts about what you did yesterday because you don't remember. So you are really present and in the moment. And you made the point that however you are, you're perfectly okay. It's another way of being. It's different from how a healthy person might be, but that doesn't mean it's not okay.
Well said. Thank you.
Wow, I think you and I have always had a great marriage. I did not anticipate how much more bonded you and I would be because of this experience with Alzheimer's disease. We as care partners are capable of far much more than we realize, not only in how lovingly and supportively you care for an individual, but also in the emotional growth and capacity that we have that most of us have not experienced in life. You can choose to make this a terrific opportunity to grow with the person you're going to be taking care of. I can't compare this to what it'll be like in the late stage, but it has primarily been a joy, a very rewarding journey for us.
It's gonna be a long road, but it is made shorter if we work on how we can live this life for ourselves and for others around us.
Thank you, Geri.
Thank you, Jim. Are we supposed to kiss?
So that's the woman I've had the honor to be married to for over 30 years, and gives you a little sense of what our journey has been like. It's whenever possible been a positive testimony to who we are and what can be done under adverse circumstances. So Geri was trained as a nurse. She couldn't afford to go to college, trained in New York City, became a visiting health nurse in Harlem when it wasn't safe, got her MPH at Columbia, did research, ended her career as the CEO of the largest long-term care facility in New York City, Beth Abraham Hospital. So she had a tremendously successful career. I did not have a career in healthcare. As I said, I was a business person involved at IBM. But in her mid-60s, Geri began to notice some cognitive issues. She got off the subway once at 14th Street in New York City and didn't know where she was or why she had gotten off there. She lost her train of thought in a staff meeting once and just quickly turned the meeting over to her number two. But finally, one morning, she went into the bathroom to comb her hair and looked into the mirror and didn't recognize her own face. This is an unusual symptom in the early stage of the disease, but it was certainly a telltale sign for her. And after that, we got an appointment with one of the noted neurologists in New York City. This was in 2012. And he diagnosed her after testing with MCI, mild cognitive impairment, which we later learned was Alzheimer's. For Geri, who'd been experiencing the cognitive issues, who had a family history of dementia, probably Alzheimer's, and with her observational training as a nurse, the diagnosis was not a surprise. For me, it was a catastrophe. I was devastated. We had just moved into New York City a few years earlier, which was a dream of mine. And so the retirement that I had envisioned was suddenly gone, at least I thought it was. So I was quite depressed. I was angry. I was sad. And I went through some of the stages of grief that are well documented. And I share this because I think it's important that care partners, caregivers are able to stay in touch with their own emotional journey. We talk so much about the emotional journey of the person we're caring for, but it's also very important that we be able to talk about our own psychological health. And that's part of the caregiving challenge of taking care of ourselves, both physically and emotionally, that will follow us throughout these years of our lives. So I was really quite despondent for a couple of weeks, isolated myself, didn't want to engage in conversation. And finally, after 2 or 3 weeks, Geri and I over dinner really came together and realized that we were not going to be able to live in disharmony. We were going to have to find out how to build a life, a new life in which we integrated the current diagnosis into our vision of what we had anticipated in retirement. Shortly after that, Geri had a therapist who she had seen as she adjusted to her retirement, which had been a very important part of her life. And when she talked to this therapist, the therapist said, well, you've clearly gotten the wrong diagnosis. You couldn't possibly be living with dementia. And so Geri had a bit of a challenge to convince this individual, whom she respected a great deal, that she, in fact, did have dementia. And when the therapist finally realized that this was true, her response was very immediate, very direct: tell no one. So the advice from a professional was to hide. Very well-meaning, well-intended, but not anything that we were able to live with. And this advice came out of an understanding of the stigma, of the public perception of people living with dementia. And that was 12 years ago. Hopefully it's not as strong as it was then, but it's something that we with Alzheimer's face on an ongoing basis. But this was quite, as you might imagine, from coming from such a trusted source, disarming to Geri. She left as soon as she could and never returned, and gave us the fodder for many evenings of conversation at dinner. And we decided that we could not live in the closet, that we were going to take this diagnosis we'd been given and figure out how we could make lemonade. It was very important to us to feel that we could live fully with the disease as we had intended to live fully without the disease. So our new life unfolded slowly. I always suggest that people take 6 months or a year to really fully adjust to the diagnosis. It's quite a smack. It's very difficult news to hear. And we only live into the diagnosis in our new life over time. And I think people are told to rush out and get their affairs in order, rush out and do this or do that. I think personally, for us, that would have been a mistake. We needed to each come to grips in our own way and in different ways with what we had learned about our coming years. But as it unfolded, we learned that we needed to be more than just about ourselves. We wanted to live with courage and with passion, and to be not only observant and attentive to what our journey was, but try to do what we could to help those around us. We had the very good fortune through the Alzheimer's Association to be connected to a Pulitzer Prize winning writer for the New York Times, a man named Sonny Kleinfeld. He was looking for someone living in the early stage of the disease, and he wanted to follow that person over 12 months and do an article about what it's like to live in the early stage of Alzheimer's. And Geri and I thought about that seriously and thought, well, my gosh, what a great opportunity. You know, if you want to really reach out to others with what we believed was a positive attitude about the disease and how we might live well, this would be a great opportunity for us. And what we originally envisioned is, you know, just a column in maybe the health section of the Times. Well, so many amazing things kept happening to us that this 1 year time with the reporter, whom we came to be very fond of, turned into 2 years. And that single column article turned into a 12-page supplement section of the New York Times, the Sunday Times, called Fraying, Fraying, Fraying at the Edges, on May 1st, 2015. So this article was appeared internationally and in Spanish, and really was extremely well received. They had published, I think, 2,000 extra copies for people that wrote in and requested a copy, and those sold out or were taken in 2 months. So the Times considered this a very successful endeavor, as it's certainly been successful for us, because it enabled us, really, with the questions that Sonny asked and the thinking that followed that, enabled us to kind of see what our path was going to be. Also, during that time, we started speaking. We first had an opportunity to speak at a church, which had an adult education program during the week, and they asked us to be the program, talking about living with Alzheimer's. And we put a lot of time in that, and it was really very, very well received. And we realized that it was something that we could give to others to help them understand what it's like to live with Alzheimer's, but maybe what the opportunities are. And we began being asked to speak at the Y, at the JCC in New York City, and churches, and began to be interviewed on radio and television. So this article in the New York Times, which we had done out of desire to benefit others, really ended up in kind of catapulting us to a national awareness, which has really given us a lot of opportunities that we might not otherwise have had. Geri, having been a nurse and a researcher, knew immediately that she wanted to participate in a clinical trial. She told me that she wanted to participate in an interventional double-blind trial. And I thought she was speaking in tongues. I had no idea what those words meant. But so we began to search and had a hard time actually finding a trial that would work for us. But after a year, we were able to find a trial in New Haven, Connecticut, at Yale University, which was really nearly a 2-hour drive for us each way. But we were extremely fortunate to find this trial. It was for a drug called aducanumab. This was in 2014. It was the stage 1 trial of this drug, which eventually became the very first FDA-approved drug to slow the progression of the disease. Of course, we didn't know that at the time. We agreed to go for monthly infusions and additional trips for safety exams, MRIs. And in the process of being diagnosed, we discovered that Geri carried a gene called APOE4. She'd gotten one gene from each parent, and only 2% of the population carries two copies of this gene, one from each parent. But it really meant that her probability of developing Alzheimer's was 12 times average. She knows that she has passed this gene to her son, and that if he has only one, it will be 3 times more probable of developing the disease than average, and possibly to her granddaughter. So it's a very personal thing for folks living with Alzheimer's to have what is the genetic disease. 50% or greater percent of the total 6 million people in the US have this gene. Less than 50% do not have the gene and are often referred to as environmental cases. Not really sure why they develop the disease, but clearly this genetic disposition certainly impacts the probability that one will develop the disease. So that was a requirement for us to get into the particular section of the trial that we were admitted into. So the stage 1, which was less than 200 people, concluded about 6 or 12 months after Geri began, and it proved to be extremely successful trial. It had erased the amyloid plaque on the brain of those on the medication. Amyloid is a protein that covers the outside of the brain of people with Alzheimer's. It actually starts to develop 15 to 20 years prior to any symptoms, but it is one of the physical characteristics of the disease. And this drug had removed that plaque and had showed improved scoring versus those on the placebo in cognitive testing. So we were thrilled, of course. This was a step. It didn't stop the disease. It didn't stop the progression, but it slowed the progression, which gave us more time in the mild stage of the disease. I thought that this was a huge advance. I thought that the phase 3, the next trial to follow, which would lead to the FDA approval of the drug, would fill up in 6 to 12 months. Who wouldn't want to be in this, be in this trial to have the opportunity for this very welcome medication, which would slow the progression of their decline? To my anger, dismay, sadness, it took 3 years, 36 months for Biogen to recruit the 3,000 people needed to begin the phase 3 trial. This really made me angry because I felt that our inability to recruit people into clinical trials was delaying a disease-modifying therapy for those people who needed it most by 2 years. So I started doing some research and learned that less than 1% of people living with Alzheimer's in the US participate in clinical trials. Less than 1%. And someone said to me, well, cancer is only 8%. And I said, well, look how many therapies and diagnostics and medications are already available for people with cancer. We should have 3 times as many people as cancer, but we don't. And many trials never even reach their full desired cohort in the number of participants. So Geri and I together have taken on one of our cause celebs to try to explain why it's important to participate in clinical trials. And the earlier, the better, as soon as you learn of your diagnosis and adjust to the new state of your life, to consider participating in a trial. The reasons people don't are complex. It's a lot to do with lack of information, lack of knowledge, lack of awareness. So we really try to speak to it whenever we have the opportunity. I'd be happy to talk more about it later if anyone would like. But what I've been quite involved in the science of this disease since that time. And I have to say that if anyone on the line is newly diagnosed or knows someone or is caring for someone who's recently been diagnosed, that it is a tremendously exciting time to be in this community. There have been tremendous breakthroughs in the last 12 years since Geri was diagnosed. Last year, the FDA gave full approval to the first disease-modifying therapy called Leqembi, Leqembi. This drug is believed to add at least 1 and hopefully 2 years to the length of time a person will spend in the mild stage of the disease when they are really very slightly impaired by a slower memory. We believe that the second drug will be approved next month. The name of that drug is donanemab. It's developed by Lilly, and they had a very successful phase 3 trial as well. So what we see is now the beginning of breakthroughs. There's no cure, there's no reversing, there's no vaccine yet, but there are very exciting drugs in trials. And we're hopeful that my wife's son and granddaughter will not have to worry about this disease by the time symptoms begin to appear. So this is a very hopeful period. But not only have the medications evolved and very exciting drugs present and on the horizon, but there's also been revolutionary developments in the screening and in the testing to diagnose the disease. You may know that just a decade or two ago, only way a person could be certain that their relative had Alzheimer's was an autopsy. And then about 10 or 15 years ago, we discovered that a spinal tap would determine that there was amyloid on the brain, and that could be a diagnostic, but also a PET scan, very expensive. Both of those diagnostics are fairly invasive, and not many people really in this country particularly are anxious to have a spinal tap. But very, very recently, we've made great progress in the biomarkers. So we are really on the verge having a general practice of having a simple blood test be a quite accurate diagnostic opportunity. So that by taking a vial of blood and sending it to the lab within 10 days, the answer can come back with 90% accuracy whether or not you have this disease. It tells you whether or not you have amyloid. I misspoke. With that amyloid presence, then additional cognitive testing is usually required to provide an affirmative decision on amyloid, on Alzheimer's. But that's a tremendous step forward for us. Also, there's challenges with these biomarkers. There's also frequently a false positive. So sometimes people are told they have amyloid when they actually do not, which is why the further testing is important. Excuse me. Also, there have been great advances in the screening for Alzheimer's. There's now, we used to have to sit down with a trained individual who would give us a test on paper and pencil. That's MoCA or MMSE is how they're referred to. But now with the advent of artificial intelligence and digital technology, that it's possible to download a program on your laptop or on your telephone, and actually in 10 or 15 minutes with AI ability to even more accurately detect whether or not you have some cognitive impairment. So the progression is that you could have a screening, you could then go and have a blood test, and if and additional cognitive testing, and if positive, you would probably then go to see a neurologist for a definitive diagnosis. There are exciting advances in the wings. Today, to get one of these drugs, you have to go in and have an infusion once a month or twice a month. Hopefully next year we'll have subcutaneous infusions so that you don't have to go to an infusion center and you can receive the drug at home. But there are lots of challenges remaining, and don't want to by any means infer that we are at an end. We are only really midway. We have great breakthroughs, great advances, but we still desperately need people willing to participate in trials and increased funding for that search. One of the very rewarding things that Geri and I have done is recently co-found a new organization that Evelyn mentioned in my introduction called Voices of Alzheimer's. As these new drugs became available, we had a real fight with Medicare to cover these drugs. Medicare, in our view, has a discriminatory history against people living with Alzheimer's.
Mhm.
They did not cover PET scans until last October, even though for 15 years we knew they were a diagnostic. They did not initially cover with the preliminary approval of the drugs, give full coverage to these breakthrough therapies. So out of that alarm, Geri and I and a wonderful group of people living with the disease and other advocacy champions for Alzheimer's founded an organization called Voices of Alzheimer's. And we were very successful. We now have over 700 members, and we were very successful last year getting our voices heard through articles in the Wall Street Journal, in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in Time Magazine, to talk about what it's like to live with this disease, but also why it's so important that Medicare approve these transformational drugs that are coming and being available for us. we try to tell folks what it's like to live with this disease and why it's important that our voices be heard. We speak out very sharply, very directly. We criticize Medicare. Other people are much more cautious. We try to call a spade and call discrimination discrimination. We published a white paper on the historic discrimination of Medicare against people living with Alzheimer's. We had die-ins last year, several. A die-in is not a sit-in, but it's where people actually dramatize their condition by pantomiming dying in place and having placards. And we use these to call attention in the press and to the general public about having breakthrough diagnoses, breakthroughs in screening and in bio blood markers that aren't receiving the appropriate accommodation that Medicare should be giving them. And we got a lot of press, and we felt very proud of that. So I would encourage you, if you're interested, and we would love for all of you to visit our website, which is simply Voices of AD, Alzheimer's disease, voicesofad.com. So if you'd like to see what we're doing and be involved and share the journey with us, we would love to have you. One of the additional things that we've done is that we have recently published what we call the Alzheimer's Bill of Rights. Evelyn, are you able to share that chart?
Minerva?
Minerva, are you able to share that chart?
Minerva, the miracle worker?
So let me tell you a little of the background. As we began to form our community, a lot of the same stories, a lot of the same themes began to be heard. Thank you. One of them is 85% of people with dementia and care partners report experiencing stigma and discrimination. I noticed that when I began to accompany Geri on her medical visits, that when Geri would ask a question or have something to tell us, he wouldn't look at Geri anymore after he knew she had dementia. He'd look at me and talk to me and remove Geri from the picture. When I took Geri to the hospital one time for a heart development, they wouldn't let me enter with her through the ambulance entrance. I got to her room 20 minutes later. She was hysterical because 3 aides were trying to force her into a hospital gown. And I asked later the next day, well, why did that happen? I said, aren't these individuals trained to deal with people with dementia? No. I couldn't understand that we all know that most hospital patients are seniors with gray hair like me. Why, with a high propensity for dementia in that population, why isn't everyone who works in a hospital or a doctor's office or any medical setting trained to interact with people with dementia? They're wonderful 4-hour courses online, 2-hour courses online to educate folks on how to approach, how to speak to, how to warmly embrace people with dementia. They're not doing it for themselves, they're doing it for us, the community. So why don't hospitals and doctors see that this happens? It is forecast that with these new treatments, that in 2 or 3 years, we will have to wait to see an initial appointment with a neurologist, possibly as long as 3 or 4 years. We're already seeing wait times of 18 months for a new patient to see a neurologist. But we all know our general practitioners are not yet able to deal with brain health. We have to go to a neurologist to get a prescription for these new drugs. If we have to wait 3 or 4 years to see a neurologist, it makes having an early stage treatment an oxymoron. So these are the types of things that are happening. We've learned that 25% of folks today are still not being informed by their physicians that they have dementia. So as we kept hearing these things over and over, we realized that we wanted to make a declaration, and we decided to call this a Bill of Rights. And it's a Bill of Rights primarily for the people with the disease, but for our entire community. It doesn't specifically address some caregiver issues. We decided to make this specifically for the patient. But you'll see here what's included. It's dignity and respect that we're entitled to. It's freedom from the discrimination I mentioned. It's for prompt diagnosis and treatment. I'll let you read the list, and you can access this list of items on our website. But many of the projects that Voices of Alzheimer's is working on really builds on this foundation. I have shared this with a number of Alzheimer's organizations and dementia organizations and had wonderful reception. You know, that something like this had been done 10 or 15 years ago, but this is the first one to have been done recently. And the field is so different because of all the changes that I've been talking about. We are in a new, totally new landscape with treatments, with diagnostics, and with screening. And the challenges have changed. So we put this together, and I'm proud of it and happy to share it with you. And I hope you'll go and for each of these points, there is a paragraph of explanation and really what we want people to understand. But the one thing that's very important, you'll see number 4 is annual cognitive screening. Most people don't know that once you're in Medicare, for those of us well over 65, are entitled to an annual cognitive wellness visit to our physician, which Medicare pays for. One of the ingredients in that annual physical is a cognitive screening. Only 20% of folks report getting a cognitive screening today. Why is that? Well, we all know that our general practitioners, our PCPs, really aren't trained and or able to deal with brain health. We have to change this. We have to provide our physicians, our general physicians, with the tools and the training they need to begin to have conversations with their patients about what the symptoms are, what to do when they notice these symptoms, how to screen their patients for diagnostic testing for whether or not there's a cognitive issue. 30% of cognitive issues are reversible. These are the issues that the general practitioners can deal with. But if they're not identified, they don't get dealt with. Vitamin deficiencies and other things like this can cause, I didn't know this, can cause cognitive impairment. So one of the projects that Voices of Alzheimer's is working on very diligently is to find the tools, the training techniques, and help run projects and to collaborate with the AFA, the American Academy of Family Practitioners, which has an organization which has over 100,000 general practitioners in there, to work with them to figure out how do we deliver this training and this information and these tools to our general practitioner community. There are only 16,000 neurologists in the country. Only half of them deal with dementia. It's very reasonable to think we may have a 3 or 4 year wait to see a neurologist to prescribe medication if we don't involve our general practitioners. There's only over 500,000 general practitioners. So even I figured out that we're going to have to address this disease by supporting and bringing general practitioners into the fray. So that's what we're doing today. I'd be happy to take questions or clarify anything I maybe didn't explain well. But I think the idea I want to leave you with is, Geri and I never anticipated where we would be today. If I would never have had the courage to be the CEO of a significant organization, and we have become a significant organization. But I just had the courage to take that first step. But I swore and promised myself that I would live this part of my life with greater courage and more passion than I had before. And I think none of us realize what we can achieve with passion and courage. So I would encourage each of you to just think about what that first step, that next step is with you. We need you. We need everybody we can encourage, we can shoulder. We need a chorus. We don't need voices. Singly, our voices aren't heard. But as a chorus, We are heard. Have you ever heard the Mormon Tabernacle Choir? They're fabulous. That's what we can be, but we need to work together. And I invite you to join us in that journey.
Jim, before we go to Q&A or comments, you and I had talked a little bit yesterday about the importance of a plan of care. Do you want to talk a little bit about that before we open it up?
Is that for the caregiver? I think maybe what you're talking about is, I feel that people, when they're diagnosed, are often rushed into doing their will and their proxy, healthcare proxy, and that, this is a very slow progressing disease, and that we first need to take our time and adjust to the diagnosis, and then begin to figure out what our life will look like. I have really some thoughts on caregiving. Maybe I should share. I think the caregiver's attitude is so important. This is a very, very difficult disease, for the person living with the disease and for the care partner. But think about the person with the disease and what their life is being taken away from them in many senses. And it's our job. I see it as my job. Let me not generalize. My job is to help make Geri's quality of life and happiness the best it can be. And it's so important that I have a positive attitude. It really makes me angry when all you hear about is caregiver burden and how difficult it is to be a dementia care partner. Well, yes, it's hard. But really, for 10 years, it wasn't that difficult. And Geri's memory wasn't great, but many things I could easily compensate for. Yes, the late stage is challenging, but we really need to look at what the opportunities are as well as the burdens, and the opportunities for us for personal growth, for developing patience, for developing kindness, for understanding what's really important in life. We've been given an opportunity and we shouldn't waste it. This is really a time that we can grow personally and support the person we're taking care of. But also extremely important is that we take care of ourselves. Very, very often, especially in the later stages, caregivers do not give sufficient attention to their own well-being. And we can't be happy, we can't be positive around the person we're taking care of if we don't have a positive attitude, if we're not taking care of ourselves. So please, and the evidence shows that rates of diabetes, heart disease, cancer are greater for people who are caregivers versus peers of same age. Don't let that happen to yourselves. Don't let that happen to the person taking care of you. Let's be sure we take care of ourselves.
You're a wonderful speaker. Wonderful.
Well, thank
And
you.
we have Tamara says, Jim, it's amazing we're advocating for our spouses can bring us. Congratulations. Thank you, Tamara.
Of course.
Okay, folks, if you're on the phone, you can press *6, and I have a little website where I can see that you've opened your line. If you're on Zoom, please feel free to unmute yourself. We would love to hear from you. Put your hand up. You can go to the chat room, whichever you like to do. Okay.
Make questions.
Please.
My father is 87, and when I took him to the neurologist, he told me, and these were his words, that unless I twist his arm, he will medicate my dad. He said that because he is advanced, that the medications at this stage for him, stage of his age, not of the dementia, that will just keep him sleepy all day, or that it could generate all kinds of side effects. And he said, if this was a younger person where we could do tries to see how he will respond and all of that, he goes, but honestly, I will just leave him alone.
Is it Janine?
Yes, sir.
Hi, Janine. This is difficult. And it's an attitude that's not unusual. If it's Leqembi, the medication he was talking about that I mentioned earlier, which is for the mild stage of the disease, the side effects that you mentioned just now are not published side effects of this treatment. There are side effects, there are significant side effects in which anybody going on the medication could understand, but sleepiness is not one of them. So I'm encountering a similar question. My wife is now in a memory care facility, and I'm saying, well, she used to have annual dermatology evaluations and annual checkups for cancer because she had breast cancer. And I'm saying, how will we get those? And the question back to me was, well, do you really want to continue those? So these are end of life questions and chronic disease questions that we have to deal with because that attitude is prevalent in our society. And I think you and your dad will have to make a decision. You maybe didn't get the best information. But I think you, as his advocate, need to decide whether you want to accept that response or whether you want to challenge that physician or find a different physician, or with consideration, perhaps accept what he's telling you, or she is telling you.
Well, I have changed neurologists for the simple reason that one literally told me when I said, okay, and this was the initial diagnose, and I said, I want to build a relationship with you. I am searching for other information to be educated about, but what should be what we're looking for to be an awareness? And his answer was, well, there's going to be a lot. And if you cannot handle it, just take him to a place where somebody else can care for him. So,
Janine, can you and I have a conversation after this call?
yes.
I think we need some more time together, and I'd love to do that. And Evelyn, how can we do that? Maybe I can put my email address in the chat, or Evelyn, or
No, that would be good.
okay, great.
We have another chat here. Jim, so glad you and your wife did the public type stuff, like the newspaper articles and stuff. It is important to bring light to our situations and make it easier for our children and grandchildren who may be genetically predisposed for the disease. I'll be right with you. I'm sorry. My mother's family had just a couple of dementia cases, but she is on Facebook talking about Alzheimer's and all the activities and events we go to let families know. Okay, I'm sorry. Someone else wanted to talk here. I didn't mean to talk over you. Tamara? Oh,
Oops, I think we lost her. I'd just like to thank that person for speaking up and speaking out.
hey, folks. We have somebody who's lived it, who knows it, knows the ins and outs, the horrors. It's a good time to ask questions or make comments.
Comments are welcome. I'm not going to criticize anybody who speaks up. Don't worry.
So the new medication for the progression of Alzheimer's, is it a universal coverage for everyone, or do you have to have a specific insurance?
Juanita, great question. It's now covered by Medicare. So and most of us are 65 and over when we develop Alzheimer's. It is not covered, but about 5% of us, Juanita, are younger onset, early onset, younger onset. So maybe 300,000 people in the US are younger than 65 when they're diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Those people are not in Medicare, so they're not covered by Medicare. They have to wait 2 years before they can qualify for Medicare and get an early stage treatment. Well, if you wait 2 years to get an early stage treatment, you may no longer be in the early stage of the disease. So one of the things that our organization is fighting for is to try to get approval for an exception to that rule, such that if you have Alzheimer's diagnosed, that you be exempted from the requirement, if you're younger than 65, to wait for 2 years to have Medicare coverage. But generally, if you're on Medicare, it has been approved universally. So you're not dependent on your insurance company.
So do you automatically have to get on the medication for the therapeutic effect to be effective immediately?
Right. I didn't clarify before, and I should have, that this is an early stage treatment. So Geri at this point would no longer benefit from the drug because she's had the disease for 12 years. But for someone who's just diagnosed and, maybe for the first 5, 6 years, I don't know, I shouldn't give you a time period, but there's an early stage and a mild stage. Anyone in that period, in that stage of the disease, can benefit from being on the disease. There are side effects. The side effects is sometimes being blood or a liquid on the brain. There are most often not any symptoms related to this side effect, but the side effect primarily happen in 2 subgroups. One is the small number of people who have the 2 APOE4 genes I mentioned earlier. That's a very small group. And also people who are on anticoagulant drugs. If you're not in either of those 2 subgroups, it's relatively safe. I shouldn't say that. It has few side effects for the people outside of those 2 categories. And there's a great amount of observation and testing that's done to ensure that people on the drug are safe, particularly because it's a new drug and we're still learning about it. So as with any new life-altering drug, there are side effects and risks you need to be aware of.
I'm going to give you a little information before we take more questions, just because I think this is important stuff. I want to thank Teresa for sending us the Wisconsin Aging and Disability Resource Center. But I want to let you all know that every place has an Aging and Disability Resource Center now. We all have area agencies on aging, and there's 640 across the United States. And you can find yours by either calling 211, by going to eldercare.acl.gov, or you can actually call Elder Care Locator, which is 800-677-1116, or any kind of caregiver resources that you may need. And the other thing that we're going to do is we're going to send out a list of how to find resources for these clinical trials. And this list it's very well vetted. It's clinicaltrials.gov, Alzheimer's Association Trial Match, National Institute on Aging, Alzheimer's Disease Cooperative Study, research centers and hospitals, clinical research organizations, and pharmaceutical companies who will assist people, to join a clinical trial if they have any kind of scholarships that are associated with it. So you'll be getting a list with your resources. The resources will include, I think we're going to print out the Bill of Rights and stick those in, we're going to email those with your post-session questionnaire. as well as this list of clinical trials and where you might find them, who you might call or go online to find. It's very interesting that Jen has done such an incredible life story here, and with so much good information and so much current information that we rarely get from professionals. Sorry. And I'm a professional.
Non-professional. Thank you. Thank you.
So I can't thank you enough. I do want to tell people we also have 3 more sessions today. Let's see, we've got one in Spanish next. What is that? Next Thursday. And that is, I believe, I'm translating loosely here, a healthy life for your brain and your body. That's just an explanation of some of the latest investigations. We also have one on Wednesday, February 28th, importance and benefits of eating healthy while caregiving. And, you know, it's a small part, but it's a big part. You know, eating healthy, taking care of yourself, that whole initiative, you know, you have to be number one, as Jim was saying. You know, it's not, I mean, you love your care recipient, you're doing it out of love, but you've got to love yourself first so that you can take care of somebody else. So with that, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
I had a quick comment to make, please.
Please, go ahead.
Jim, one thing you mentioned in speaking about the clinical trials and the lack of participation, like less than 1% or less of people with Alzheimer's participating in clinic or clinical trials. It kind of raised something for me that I just experienced with my mom, who is suffering with Alzheimer's, and she was not selected for the Leqembi trial, but was asked to come to participate in a different trial with Duke. I can't remember, I wasn't able to go to that appointment. My brother-in-law went instead, and I don't exactly know what the trial is, to be honest. But one thing she commented to me, like last time I saw her, was her anxiety and worry now over having to go back through these additional tests. And, you know, my response to her was, well, then don't go. I mean, I don't, you know, I don't want her to have any more anxiety than she already has in life right now. So I can't help but wonder if maybe that's why we're seeing less participation, you know, because that kind of thing is going on in the community. And maybe that was the wrong response for me to have, but, you know, want to protect her for many.
Of course.
Yeah.
Especially, thank you for sharing that. One of the things we have been trying to get done is sharing test results from one test to another, or one pharmaceutical company to another, because you're absolutely right. I mean, why go through the very same test you had 3 months ago and not get into a trial?
And I don't think she's worried about not getting in. She's worried about having to go and get asked the questions and not have the right, you know, fail the test again, because she feels like, you know, she still has enough awareness to know that she just failed the test, you know. So it's that. Yeah.
I have 2, and Ashley, you know, you've got to do what's best for your mother. For your mother, and how you perceive it. I just have to say, there is discomfort, of course. You go and have psychological testing and you fail, and you feel like you failed them. You know, there's no failure, but you can feel the decline from quarter to quarter. But I have to tell you, when I brought Geri home, when I would drive her home after an infusion, I like to share the story that it feels like I had Madame Curie in the car. Geri knew with very little you can do about this disease, and very little few positive steps you can take. That's changing, but it's been hard to get there. But she felt like she was doing, by being in a clinical trial, everything she could. She was one of those, you know, scientists right there with the microscope, looking at those germs and those cells. She knew she couldn't do anything more, and she knew she had the guilt, and she called it guilt, of having passed a bad gene to her son. So especially if you have familial Alzheimer's or this APOE4 gene, you really get especially a boost and a good feeling from knowing there's nothing more you can do than be in a trial. At the same time, if there are risks that are too great for you, If the testing is too much psychologically for you, then it's probably better. But there also, I should say, Ashley, there's two kinds of trials: interventional, in which you receive a medication, and observational, in which maybe you go for once a year for a physical, or you may do some running or some things like that, physical exercise. So without the frequency of dementia testing. So there may be alternative tests that she would feel very good about that she could look into.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks
Well,
for the
Jim,
question.
I hate to end this. I feel like we could probably go on for another couple of hours with your information and experience. I want to thank you so much. What a beautiful presentation it was.
Thank you.
I also want to ask you that we had some questions about the names of the medications. Are those on your website?
They are, but should I put them in chat?
Sure, that'd be great.
I'll do it quickly. So the current one is Leqembi, Leqembi. And the second one, which is awaiting announcement, is currently called Donanemab or something close to that.
And hopefully they'll change that name.
That's a Lilly drug.
Yes, all right. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It has been a real pleasure working with you, Jim.
Oh, thank you.
And look at all of the important input we had. If you still have questions, please go ahead and email Jim. I need to stop the recording now. And I also want to thank the WellMed Charitable Foundation for all that they do. This will be in a podcast. At the very beginning in the chat room, it gave you the podcast information. It's caregiverteleconnection.org. We would love for you to go on there. There are many expert topics on there from the last couple of years. There's hardly anything that we haven't touched on, and all by experts in their own little field, like nutrition or exercise. I mean, everything you can think of. So thank you all so much, and we hope to see you at the upcoming sessions. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you.